They say words can't kill a man, but they can destroy his dignity. They can expose his soul. And on one particular night in 1965, at a party in the Hollywood Hills where champagne flowed like water and egos stood taller than the palm trees outside, Marlon Brando learned that lesson the hard way. Because that was the night the greatest actor of his generation decided to humiliate Dean Martin in front of 43 witnesses. That was the night Brando called Dean empty, hollow, a manufactured persona with nothing underneath. And that was the night Dean Martin, without raising his voice, without breaking a sweat, delivered a response so devastating, so surgically precise, that Marlon Brando's face went white and he left the party 20 minutes later, never to mention Dean Martin's name in public again. This is the story of that confrontation. This is a story of what happens when a man who thinks he's the smartest person in every room picks a fight with someone he doesn't understand. This is the story of the night Marlon Brando learned that cool isn't empty, it's armor, and the man wearing it might just be sharper than you ever imagined. The two titans, a study in opposites. To understand the earthquake of that evening, you first have to understand the fault lines. You have to understand who these two men were, what they represented, and why Hollywood in 1965 saw them as occupying completely different universes. Marlon Brando was a god. There's no other way to say it. After A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront, he had redefined what it meant to be an actor. He brought method acting to the mainstream, turning performance into a kind of spiritual excavation. He didn't just play characters. He became them. He suffered for them. He tortured himself in the service of truth, and he never let anyone forget it. Brando carried himself with the weight of his own importance. He read Sartre. He discussed Stanislavski. He held court at dinner parties, pontificating about the craft, about the art, about the responsibility of the artist to society. He looked down on entertainers, on song and dance men, on anyone who made their living through charm rather than depth. To Brando, acting was religion. Everything else was prostitution. He was respected. He was revered. He was also, if we're being honest, insufferable. Then there was Dean Martin. To the casual observer, to the critics, to the intellectuals who thought they had Hollywood figured out, Dean was the opposite of everything Brando represented. Dean was light. Dean was easy. Dean was the guy who stumbled onto stage with a rocks glass, told some jokes, sang a few songs, and stumbled off again. He made it look effortless. He made it look mindless. And that, the intellectuals concluded, was because there was no mind involved. Dean Martin was dismissed as a Vegas act in nice suits. He was written off as Frank's sidekick, as Jerry Straightman, as a manufactured Italian crooner who got lucky. The critics savaged his movies as fluff. They mocked his television show as lowbrow entertainment for the masses. They looked at his cool demeanor, his half-closed eyes, his perpetual cigarette, and they saw nothing behind it. They saw a handsome show. They saw a performance with no performer. Marlon Brando believed this completely. He had said as much in interviews, though never naming Dean directly. He had talked about the difference between actors and personalities, between artists and products, between men who had something to say and men who had something to sell. What Brando didn't know, what none of the intellectuals knew, was that Dean Martin's cool wasn't emptiness. It was strategy. It was protection. It was the armor of a man who had grown up dirt poor in Steubenville, Ohio, who had worked as a bootlegger and a car dealer, who had clawed his way to the top of an industry that chewed up and spat out men twice as talented. Dean's cool was survival, and beneath it lay a mind that was always 3 steps ahead, always watching, always calculating. Dean didn't need to prove himself. He didn't need to explain himself. He had learned long ago that the man who talks the most is usually the man who's most afraid. So he stayed quiet. He stayed cool. He let people underestimate him. And he waited for them to make mistakes. The setup, Clash of Kingdoms. The party was at the Bel Air home of a prominent producer whose name has been lost time, but whose guest list that night read like a who's who of Hollywood royalty. Frank Sinatra was there. Sammy Davis Jr. was holding court near the piano. Elizabeth Taylor floated through in diamonds. Directors, writers, studio heads, all of them drinking expensive scotch and pretending they weren't constantly calculating who had more power than whom. Marlon Brando arrived late, as was his habit. He liked to make an entrance. He liked the way conversation would pause when he walked in, the way people would straighten up, hoping to catch his attention, hoping he might find him interesting enough to engage. Dean Martin was already there, sitting in a corner with a small group, nursing what everyone assumed was whiskey, but was probably apple juice. Dean had perfected the art of looking drunk while staying stone-cold sober. It was part of the act, but it was also part of the protection. If people thought you were drunk, they underestimated you. They talked more freely. They revealed more than they intended. For most of the evening, the two men moved in separate orbits. Brando was the sun, loud and hot and demanding attention. Dean was the moon, quiet and cool and perfectly content to let others shine. There was no reason for their paths to cross. There was no reason for conflict. But ego, especially when marinated in alcohol and insecurity, has a way of seeking out confrontation. It started when someone, trying to be clever, trying to get Brando going, made a comment about the difference between real actors and entertainers. It was meant as flattery to Brando, a way of elevating him above the mere mortals in the room. And Brando, who had already had several drinks and was feeling philosophical, took the bait. He began to expound on his theories of acting. He talked about truth and vulnerability and the courage it took to strip yourself bare on screen. He talked about the responsibility of the artist. And then, perhaps because he noticed Dean sitting there, looking utterly disinterested, perhaps because he wanted to make his point crystal clear, perhaps because he simply couldn't help himself, Brando made his fatal mistake. He pointed across the room at Dean Martin. The insult words as weapons. The gesture itself was theatrical. Of course it was. Everything Brando did was theatrical. He extended his arm, the glass of bourbon catching the light, and he pointed directly at Dean Martin, who was in the middle of lighting a cigarette. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It happened in waves. The people closest to Brando stopped talking first, then the people near Dean, then everyone else. As they realized something was happening, something they would want to tell their friends about tomorrow. 43 people, all of them frozen, all of them watching. Brando's voice was clear and loud and dripping with condescension. You want to know the difference between an actor and a personality? Look at him. Dean Martin. He's the perfect example. He's not an actor. He's not even really an entertainer. He's a persona. He's a carefully constructed facade with absolutely nothing behind it. He's empty. He's a handsome suit with a mediocre voice. And America has convinced itself that's enough. But there's no there. There never has been. The silence that followed was excruciating. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, the kind that makes you wish you were anywhere else. People looked at their shoes. They looked at their drinks. They looked anywhere except at Dean Martin. Because watching a man get humiliated in public feels like watching someone get shot. Frank Sinatra's face went red. He started to rise from his chair, ready to defend his friend, ready to tear Brando apart with the same fury that had made him legendary in barroom brawls. But before Frank could move, before anyone could move, something happened. Dean Martin laughed. Not a fake laugh. Not a nervous laugh. A genuine, quiet chuckle that somehow cut to the tension like a knife through butter. He took a long, slow drag from his cigarette, letting the smoke curl up toward the ceiling. And he looked at Brando with those half-closed eyes that people mistook for drunkenness, but which were actually the eyes of a man who saw everything. And then he spoke. Dean's response, the surgical strike. Dean's voice was soft. It always was. He never needed to shout. He had learned long ago that the quieter you speak, the harder people have to listen. And in that moment, with 43 people holding their breath, they were listening very hard indeed. You know, Marlon. Dean said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. I've been watching you all night, and I've been thinking about what you just said, about being empty, about being a facade. And you're right about one thing. I am a persona. I've spent my whole career building it, protecting it, perfecting it. He paused, took another drag, and the pause was masterful. It let the tension build. It let everyone lean in. But here's what's interesting. My persona makes people happy. They come to my shows, they watch my movies, they listen to my records, And for a couple hours, they forget about their problems. They laugh. They relax. They feel good. That's what I give them. That's my job. And I'm damn good at it. Another pause. Brando's face was starting to change. The smug certainty was cracking. But you, Marlon, you're fascinating to me. Because you convince yourself that all that suffering you do, all that method acting torture, all that pretentious philosophizing about truth and vulnerability, you convince yourself that makes you deep. That makes you real. But I've got news for you, pal. Dean leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped even lower, so quiet now that people in the back of the room were straining to hear. The emptiest people I've ever met are the ones who spend all their time telling everyone how full they are. You want to talk about facades? You're wearing the biggest one in this room. You hide behind Stanislavski and Strasberg because you're terrified that without all that intellectual scaffolding, people might see you for what you really are. A scared kid from Omaha who's so desperate to be taken seriously that he turned himself into a walking lecture. The room was dead silent now. Frank Sinatra was grinning. Sammy Davis Jr. had his hand over his mouth. Elizabeth Taylor's eyes were wide. Dean wasn't done. I know I'm a product, Marlon. I've always known it. I don't pretend to be an artist. I don't pretend to be changing the world. I sing songs. I tell jokes. I make movies where I play a version of myself and I cash the checks. And I sleep just fine at night because I know exactly what I am and I'm comfortable with it. He stubbed out his cigarette in the ashtray beside him, never breaking eye contact with Brando. But you need everyone to believe you're this profound, tortured genius, because the truth is, deep down, you know that all that suffering, all that method, all that seriousness, it's just another act. It's just a different kind of empty. And the really sad part, Marlon, is that your act doesn't even make people happy. It just makes them uncomfortable. Dean stood up, smoothed his jacket, and gave Brando a small, almost sympathetic smile. So, yeah, I'm empty. I'm a facade. But at least I'm honest about it. Can you say the same? And with that, Dean Martin picked up his drink, nodded to Frank, and walked out of the room and onto the terrace, leaving Marlon Brando standing there with his mouth slightly open and his face the color of ash. The aftermath. Hollywood remembers. What happened next became legend. The 43 witnesses to that confrontation spent the next week telling everyone they knew. The story spread through Hollywood like wildfire. By the end of the month, everyone from studio heads to grip workers had heard some version of the tale. And with each retelling, Dean Martin's stock rose while Marlon Brando's mystique took a beating. Brando left the party less than 20 minutes after the exchange. He didn't say goodbye to the host. He didn't finish his drink. He just walked out, got in his car, and drove away. Those who saw him leave said he looked like a man who had just been in a car accident, shaken, diminished, confused about what had just happened to him. In the days that followed, Brando tried to save face. He told people that Dean had misunderstood him, that he had been taken out of context, that it was all in good fun. But nobody bought it. Everyone who had been there knew exactly what had happened. They had watched the great Marlon Brando, the method actor supreme, get intellectually dismantled by a man he had dismissed as an empty suit. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Brando had spent years cultivating an image of himself as the deepest thinker in Hollywood, and in one 2-minute exchange, Dean Martin had exposed the insecurity beneath that image. Dean had done to Brando exactly what Brando accused him of being. He had revealed the facade. What made it even more devastating was that Dean didn't gloat. He didn't tell the story himself. He didn't need to. When reporters asked him about it, he just shrugged and said, "Marlon's a hell of an actor. We just see things differently." It was classic Dean, gracious in victory, giving his opponent a way to save face even after destroying him. But Hollywood remembered. For the rest of his career, whenever Brando got too pretentious, whenever he started pontificating about the art of acting, someone would inevitably bring up that night. They'd chuckle and say, "Remember when Dean Martin took him apart?" And Brando, to his credit, would go quiet. He never spoke Dean Martin's name in public again. Not in interviews. Not at parties. Not anywhere. It was as if that night in Bel Air had taught him a lesson that even his method acting teachers couldn't. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is know when you've been beaten. The deeper truth, what it all meant. But here's the thing that most people missed about that confrontation. It wasn't really about Dean versus Marlon. It wasn't about entertainers versus actors. It wasn't even about empty versus full. It was about authenticity versus performance. See, Marlon Brando had spent his entire career claiming to be authentic. He was a real deal. He was truth. He was raw emotion and genuine feeling. But what Dean exposed that night was that Brando's authenticity was itself a performance. It was a carefully crafted image of depth, designed to make people think he was more substantial than everyone else. Dean Martin, on the other hand, had built his entire career on performance. Everyone knew it was an act. He played a drunk who wasn't drunk. He played it cool when he cared deeply. He wore a mask and never pretended otherwise. But here's the paradox. By being honest about a performance, by never claiming to be anything other than what he was, Dean was actually more authentic than Brando could ever be. Dean understood something fundamental that Brando didn't. He understood that we're all performing all the time. Every human interaction is a kind of theater. We all choose how to present ourselves to the world. The only real question is whether we're honest about it. Brando performed intellectualism. He performed depth. He performed authenticity. But he insisted it wasn't performance, and that insistence made him a fraud. Dean performed coolness. He performed ease. He performed attachment. But he never claimed it was anything other than performance, and that honesty made him real. The greatest trick Dean Martin ever pulled wasn't convincing the world. He was drunk when he was sober. It was being completely genuine about being completely fake. And in that circularity, in that paradox, lay a kind of truth that was more profound than anything Brando ever achieved with all his method acting torture. The people who loved Dean understood this instinctively. They knew that the guy on stage wasn't the whole person. They knew that beneath the cool exterior was a dedicated father, a loyal friend, a sharp businessman, and a man who felt things deeply, but chose not to display those feelings for public consumption. The performance wasn't a lie. It was a boundary. It was a way of saying, this is what I'm willing to share. The rest is mine. Brando could never understand that. He thought that tearing yourself open, exposing your wounds, suffering publicly for your art was a height of honesty. But what he never realized was that true dignity often requires keeping some things private, that strength sometimes looks like reserve, that the deepest people are often the quietest. The long shadow, how one night changed everything. In the years after that confrontation, something interesting happened. The narrative around both men began to shift. Critics started to reassess Dean Martin's work. They began to notice the subtlety in his acting, the intelligence in his timing, the craft in what always appeared effortless. Films like Rio Bravo and The Young Lions were re-examined and found to contain performances of genuine depth and nuance. His television show was recognized not as lowbrow entertainment, but as a masterclass in hosting, in putting guests at ease, in creating an atmosphere where spontaneity could flourish. People started to realize that making something look easy is often harder than making something look hard. That Dean's apparent effortlessness was a result of meticulous preparation, perfect timing, and an intuitive understanding of his audience that no amount of method acting could teach. Meanwhile, Brando's reputation began its slow descent. He became known as difficult, unprofessional, self-indulgent. He showed up to sets unprepared, demanded rewrites, required cue cards, and generally behaved like a man who believed his own legend. The tortured artist became the temperamental diva, and people lost patience with it. By the 1970s, when Brando was taking roles just for money and Dean was still packing them in Vegas, the reversal was complete. The empty suit had substance. The profound artist was phoning it in. Was that night at the Bel Air party responsible for this shift? Of course not. Careers rise and fall on the quality of work and the vicissitudes of public taste. But that confrontation did something important. It planted a seed of doubt about the narratives Hollywood had constructed around both men. It made people question their assumptions. It made them look closer. And when they looked closer at Dean Martin, they liked what they saw. They saw a man who had survived in a brutal industry for decades without compromising his dignity or betraying his friends. They saw a father who loved his children fiercely. They saw a performer who gave everything to his audience but kept his soul to himself. They saw someone who understood that in a world of phonies, the most radical act is be exactly who you say you are, even if who you say you are is performance. The final word, legacy of a perfect comeback. Marlon Brando died in 2004, remembered as one of the greatest actors who ever lived, but also as a tragic figure who squandered his talent and alienated nearly everyone who tried to work with him. Dean Martin died in 1995, remembered as an entertainer who brought joy to millions and as a man who never recovered from the loss of his son. Neither man lived to see the internet age, when that story about their confrontation would be shared and reshared, analyzed and dissected, turned into a lesson about handling bullies and about the difference between intelligence and intellectualism. But if they could see it, you know how they'd react. Brando would probably write a long, rambling explanation about how he was misunderstood, about the context everyone was missing, about how the whole story was emblematic of America's anti-intellectualism and its preference for surface over substance. Dean would probably just smile that sleepy smile, take a drag from a cigarette, and say, "It's ancient history, pal. Who cares?" Because that was Dean, never dwelling, never explaining, never trying to convince anyone of anything, just living his life, performing his act, and letting the chips fall where they may. The lesson of that night in 1965 isn't about who was right and who was wrong. It's not about whether method acting is superior to charm or whether entertainers are less valuable than artists. The lesson is simpler and more profound. It's about the danger of assumption, about the foolishness of judging a book by its cover, about the reality that the quietest person in the room might be the sharpest, about the fact that cool isn't cold, reserve isn't emptiness, and a man who doesn't feel the need to prove himself probably has nothing to prove. Marlon Brando learned that lesson the hard way, in front of 43 witnesses, at the hands of a man he had dismissed as empty. And Dean Martin? Dean already knew it. He had known it all along. He just didn't see any reason to advertise the fact. That's the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge tells you what to say. Wisdom tells you when to say nothing at all. And on that night in Bel Air, when Marlon Brando called him empty and Dean Martin responded with the most devastating comeback in Hollywood history, the whole room learned the difference. Some of them learned it quickly. Some of them learned it slowly. And one of them, the greatest actor of his generation, learned it too late to do him any good. But they all learned it. And Hollywood never forgot.